Welcome to Pillow Time Lore, where dreams take shape and stories wrap around you like your favorite blanket. You've made it through the day, and now it's time to slow down, breathe deeply, and drift into a world made just for you. So, fluff up your pillow, snuggle into your coziest spot, and let your eyes get heavier with each word. This is your moment. No to-do lists, no noise, just stillness and a little magic. With each breath in, feel the tension melt from your shoulders. With each breath out, let go of everything that doesn't serve your peace. You're safe here. Tonight's story is soft and soothing, like a warm cup of tea for your thoughts, carefully crafted to calm your busy mind and help you drift gently into sleep. So close your eyes, dear dreamer. Let your imagination wander while I carry you into a land where anything is possible and everything ends in peace. This is Pillow Time Lore. The dorm was alive with the sound of suitcases rolling, doors creaking open, and excited chatter bouncing down the hallways. It was the first night of college, and everyone seemed eager to meet new people and settle in. Aaliya, however, stood quietly by her bed, watching her new roommate unpack with ease. She had always been the quiet type, curious about the world, but too shy to jump in right away. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard, a mix of new beginnings and nervous energy. Outside, laughter echoed as students explored the campus, already forming little groups. Aaliya hugged her notebook close, telling herself she would eventually fit in. But tonight, she felt like a guest in someone else's story, unable to sleep. She sat by the window and looked out at the campus. Street lamps glowed like soft yellow moons, and the night carried a calm she hadn't expected. That's when she noticed it, a tiny cafe across the street, tucked between two tall buildings. Its windows were lit warmly, almost invitingly, even though it was nearly midnight. The oddest part, a handwritten sign on the door read, "Open from 12 o'clock to dawn." Her roommate, half asleep on her bed, mumbled, "Oh, that place. Someone said it's only open at night. Weird, right?" And then drifted back into her dreams. Aaliya's eyes stayed glued to the glowing windows. The cafe looked cozy, with shelves of books and the faint outline of steaming mugs visible from afar. She wondered who would run a cafe at such an hour, and why students would need coffee when the world was asleep. For some reason, she felt as though the place was waiting for her. The next evening, as Aaliya returned from orientation, she found something unusual on the floor just inside her dorm room. A single folded flyer lay there, crisp and clean, as though it had been placed with care. Curious, she picked it up. The message, written in neat handwriting, read, "Come to the Midnight Café. Free coffee for dreamers." Her heart skipped. Midnight Café, the same glowing little place she had seen last night. She glanced at her roommate, Sara, who was scrolling through her phone. "Did you put this here?" Aaliya asked. Sara shook her head without looking up. Nope, but wow, free coffee. Sounds like a prank. Aaliya turned the paper over. No names, no details, just those words. She laughed nervously. Who even drinks coffee at midnight? Sara grinned. College kids who don't want to study, obviously. But hey, it could be fun. Wanna check it out? If it's creepy, we'll just run. The hours ticked slowly. Aaliya tried to read, but her mind kept wandering back to the flyer. Something about the words for dreamers tugged at her. It felt personal, almost as though the cafe knew she had been staring at it last night. By the time the clock crept past 11:30, Aaliya found herself slipping on a sweater. Sara was already by the door, teasing adventure time. Together they stepped into the cool night. The campus was quiet, the lampposts casting long shadows on the path as they neared the little cafe. Aaliya noticed its door already open, the warm glow spilling out like golden honey onto the street. The flyer had promised free coffee, but she had a feeling the cafe held something more. The bell above the door gave a soft ting as Aaliya and Sara stepped inside. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans, vanilla, and something sweeter like cinnamon drifting through the air. It wasn't crowded, but nearly every table had a student sitting with a steaming mug, talking in hushed voices. Some laughed, some whispered, and some simply listened. Aaliya noticed right away no one had a phone. No glowing screens, no earbuds, just people, face to face, sharing words. On each table sat a small card that read, Rule 1, no phones. Rule 2, share if you wish. Rule 3, listen always. Sara raised her eyebrows. This is different. Behind the counter stood the owner, an older man with kind eyes and silver hair pulled neatly back. He didn't look surprised to see them. In fact, when his gaze landed on Aaliya, he smiled knowingly, as if he had been expecting her all along. Welcome, dreamers, he said softly. His voice was calm, steady, like a story being read by a grandfather. First cup is free. Sit where you like, they ordered. And soon, a waitress brought them mugs that steamed with a rich, chocolatey aroma. Aaliya took a cautious sip and felt warmth spread through her chest, almost like the drink carried comfort itself. At the table next to them, a boy spoke about missing home across the room. A girl admitted she was afraid of failing her classes. The others listened with patience, nodding, offering gentle words. It wasn't gossip, was sharing, like each confession was safe here. Sara leaned in, decidedly cozy. Aaliya nodded, her eyes drifting back to the old man. Somehow, he already seemed to know her fears, like the cafe itself had been waiting to hear her story. The night stretched on like a gentle lullaby. Students took turns speaking, each voice weaving into the cafe's quiet warmth. Aaliya sat frozen, her fingers wrapped tightly around her mug, wishing she could stay invisible. But then the old man's eyes found hers, not stern, not demanding, just patient, like he was waiting for her to breathe. Would you like to share something? He asked softly. Aaliya's heart thudded. Her first instinct was to shake her head, but when she looked around, no one was staring at her with judgment. They were waiting, ready to listen. Even Sara gave her a small nod of encouragement. She swallowed hard. I don't know if I belong here," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but no one interrupted. Everyone seems so confident, like they already know what they're doing. And me, I feel like I'm pretending, like if people look too closely, they'll see I'm not good enough. Her cheeks burned, and she stared down at the steam rising from her cup. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, one by one, voices rose gently. A boy across the room said, "I feel the same." A girl near the counter added, "I cried my first week here." Another laughed softly, "I still do sometimes." The air shifted. Aaliya lifted her eyes and saw something she hadn't expected understanding. No one mocked her. No one dismissed her words. They nodded like family, carrying her feelings as if they'd felt them too. A warmth spread through her chest, stronger than the coffee. For the first time since arriving at college, she didn't feel alone. And in that moment, the Midnight Café didn't feel like just a cafe, it felt like magic. The next night, Aaliya and Sara returned to the Midnight Café. Something about the place tugged at them both like it wasn't just a cafe, but a gentle escape from the noise of the outside world. They slipped into the same corner table as before, the warm glow of hanging lamps painting soft circles on the wooden floor. When Aaliya set down her cup of cocoa, she noticed something unusual. A notebook lay on the table, bound in worn brown leather, its corners frayed with age. It hadn't been there before. She glanced around. No one seemed to be watching. Curiosity won. She opened the first page. The handwriting inside was neat, flowing, almost elegant. But what made her heart skip was the story written there. A boy talking about missing his home, and how he couldn't sleep in the dorms. Her mind raced. That was exactly what the boy at the cafe had shared last night. She turned another page. A short story about a girl afraid of failing her classes. Another page, someone who confessed to crying in the library bathroom. Every single entry wasn't fiction at all. They were the exact confessions students had. Spoken here. Sara leaned over her shoulder, frowning. This is creepy. How can their words be written down? No one was writing. Aaliya flipped further and froze. There, in the last entry, were her own words, her shaky confession from last night about not being good enough. Even the hesitation, the pauses, the cracks in her voice, all captured perfectly. The notebook almost seemed alive, recording the souls of everyone who entered. Aaliya shut it quickly, her fingers trembling, and for the first time, the cozy cafe felt just a little too mysterious. The week rolled on with the rhythm of lectures, assignments, and sleepless nights. But something felt wrong. Sara, Aaliya's cheerful roommate, hadn't shown up to breakfast, skipped to classes, and by the third day, her bed was neatly made too neatly, as if she had never slept there at all. When Aaliya asked around, people only shrugged. "Oh, Sara, didn't you hear? She transferred out." Transferred? That made no sense. Just yesterday, Sara had been laughing about how she couldn't even find her math class. Aaliya's chest tightened. Transferred felt less like truth and more like an excuse, whispered to hide something no one wanted to question. That night, unable to shake the unease, Aaliya returned to the Midnight Café alone. The bell above the door chimed, the warmth inside wrapping around her. But tonight, she didn't feel comforted. She sat down, and there it was, the brown leather notebook, waiting for her like always. Hands trembling, she flipped it open. Her eyes darted across the pages until they stopped cold. Sara's name. It was written at the top of a page, followed by a short story, her story, how she had confessed her fear of being average, of never standing out, of being forgotten. But what made Aaliya's blood run cold was the way the ink looked faint, as though the words were dissolving into the paper, letter by letter. Her throat went dry. Just last night, the words had been bold and clear. Now, Sara's story was fading, and with it, Sara herself seemed to have disappeared. Aaliya clutched the notebook, her pulse racing. The Midnight Café wasn't just a place for sharing dreams. Somehow, it was taking them. Aaliya couldn't focus on lectures anymore. Every time she looked at Sara's empty chair, her stomach knotted. The teachers spoke of her transfer so casually, as if Sara had never existed. But Aaliya knew better. She had seen her name fading in the notebook. That night, Aaliya tossed in bed. Wide awake, she couldn't let it go. The cafe was at the heart of this, she could feel it. And there was only one way to know the truth. At midnight, while the dorm halls were quiet, she slipped on her sweater and crept outside. The streets were empty, the air heavy with silence. The cafe glowed ahead, warm and welcoming as always. But tonight, Aaliya didn't walk in. Instead, she pressed herself against the window, peeking. Inside, the cafe looked the same, lamps glowing, mugs steaming, but it was empty. No students, no chatter, just the old man behind the counter. His silver hair shone under the dim light as he sat at a table. Hunched over the leather notebook, Aaliya's breath caught. His hand moved steadily, pen scratching across the pages. She squinted and felt her chest tighten. He was writing names of students. Some she recognized, others she didn't. And as he wrote, Aaliya saw the same eerie fading, the letters dimming like smoke. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to gasp. Each fading name matched a student who hadn't been seen in class. The old man paused, as if sensing something. He looked up suddenly, his eyes sweeping the cafe. Aaliya ducked behind the wall, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. The Midnight Café wasn't just listening to stories, it was choosing who saddened, who disappeared. The next evening, Aaliya couldn't stay away. She had to know. Her steps felt heavy as she pushed open the cafe door. The bell chimed softly, but tonight she didn't feel warmth. Instead, a chill followed her in. The old man was waiting, seated at the corner table, with the leather notebook resting in front of him. His calm eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally, he gestured for her to sit. "You've seen it, haven't you?" His voice was steady, not accusing, not defensive, simply tired. Aaliya's throat tightened. "Sara, she's gone, and you're writing names. You're making them disappear." The man shook his head slowly. "Not me, child. The cafe is not a prison, it's a mirror. It doesn't take anyone. It only reflects the choice they make themselves." Aaliya frowned. "Choice? What choice?" He tapped the notebook gently. "Every student who comes here carries a weight: fear, doubt, loneliness. The cafe listens. It writes what they carry inside. But if they let go of themselves, complete life, they stop fighting for their place in life. Their ink begins to fade. And when the last letter is gone, they vanish into their own forgotten dreams." His words sank into her like stones into water. Aaliya shook her head. "That's not fair. Sara didn't want to disappear." The man's gaze softened. "No one does. But the cafe cannot save those who no longer believe in their story. It only keeps record. I don't choose Aaliya. They do." She stared at the notebook, her pulse quickening. Her name was still there, bold and clear for now, but she couldn't shake the fear. How long before her ink began to fade? The following week weighed heavily on Aaliya. Classes piled up, assignments blurred together, and whispers of confidence from other students only made her feel smaller. At night, she stared at her books but couldn't focus. The voice in her head grew louder. "You don't belong here. You're not good enough." One night, she returned to the cafe, hoping for comfort. The old man welcomed her with the same patient smile. But when her eyes drifted to the leather notebook, her heart nearly stopped. Her name, it was there, Aaliya, not as it had been before. The edges of the letters had grown faint, the bold strokes now soft, as if rubbed with an eraser. She touched the page with trembling fingers. The fading was slow, but real. Her chest tightened. "Why?" she whispered. The old man's voice was gentle. "Because you've started to believe the doubts. You're letting your story slip away." Tears pricked her eyes. "But I don't want to disappear." "Then you must fight for yourself," he said simply. "The cafe listens. It mirrors what's inside you. If you choose despair, the ink fades. But if you choose hope, even in fear, your name will burn bright again." The room felt silent, every flicker of candlelight urging her to decide. Aaliya clenched her fists. She remembered Sara's laughter, her own late-night worries, the warmth of the cafe when people listened to her heart. She wasn't ready to vanish into silence. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered, "I choose to stay." The notebook shimmered faintly, the letters of her name glowing just a little stronger. The test wasn't about being perfect. It was about refusing to give up. The Midnight Café was quieter than ever that night. The soft hum of voices had faded. Only a handful of students remained, sitting with tired eyes and nervous fingers curled around their cups. Aaliya felt the weight of the notebook beside her, its leather cover warm under her palm, as if alive. She knew it was her turn again. The old man didn't ask, he only watched, his silver eyes patient, as though the choice was entirely hers. Aaliya's chest rose and fell. Last time, she had whispered her fears. Tonight, she would whisper something else. She stood, voice trembling but steady enough to carry. I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought I was pretending to be someone I'm not. But maybe that's what growing up is. Pretending until you realize you're stronger than you thought. Maybe we're all just trying. Her words hung in the air. A girl near the counter wiped her eyes. A boy at the back nodded, shoulders loosening as though he'd been holding his breath. Aaliya pressed on, her courage rising. I don't want to disappear. I don't want to give up, even if I stumble, even if I fail. Sometimes I choose to stay. I choose to believe my story is still being written. The notebook glowed faintly, its fading letters brightening until her name shone bold and dark, carved deep into the page as if it could never be erased. The room itself seemed to exhale, the walls warmer, the lights softer, and then, like a ripple across water, Sara appeared, standing near the door, looking dazed but whole, her eyes wide as though she'd woken from a long dream. Aaliya's throat tightened with relief, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The old man closed the notebook gently, his smile wistful. You see, child, the cafe doesn't exist to take you away. It exists to remind you that you matter, that even in the loneliest nights, your voice deserves to be heard. Aaliya looked around the room. Every student's name glowed brightly in the book now, none fading, all alive with possibility. For a moment, they weren't strangers anymore. They were bound by the fragile courage of admitting they were afraid, still choosing to stay. Outside, a thin line of gold touched the horizon. Dawn, the cafe's lamps flickered, one by one, as if bowing to the sun. The old man poured himself one last cup of coffee, then whispered, almost to himself, "My work here is done." When Aaliya blinked, the cafe door swung open to the morning light. By the time she looked back, the cafe was gone. No building, no sign, no bell above the door, just the empty street and the echo of warmth in her chest. But she didn't feel sad, because the cafe had never really been about coffee or midnight gatherings. It was about the choice to keep living your story, even when it felt too heavy. Years later, whenever Aaliya struggled, she would close her eyes and remember that night, the glow of the cafe, the fading ink, the return of her friend, and she would remind herself, the story only ends when you stop writing a hand with that. She kept walking forward into the sunlight.